Dave Talks Comics, Episode 56, Who's OHotMU, Part 2.1. Dave Talks Comics is a podcast on the subjects of comic books and cartoons. I talk about comic books I have read and cartoons I have watched. Dave Talks Comics can be found on the web at davetalkscomics.com. You can subscribe to Dave Talks Comics through iTunes or Stitcher. Comments can be left at davetalkscomics.com or facebook.com/davetalkscomics. Dave Talks Comics is not a spoiler-free podcast. I try not to spoil everything in talking about these comics and cartoons, but I will almost certainly spoil them in some way. On this episode of Dave Talks Comics, I will be starting to read through I'm not reading them, but I will be starting to go through and talk about the entries in the second issues of the original editions of Who's Who, the definitive directory of the DC Universe, and the official handbook of the Marvel Universe. Who's Who 2.1. I'm finally getting into issue 2 of Who's Who. This is cover dated April 1985. Okay, so this issue of Who's Who has quite a few big names in it. It includes Batman, Batgirl, Batwoman, Bizarro, the Blackhawks, and I guess a few others, but also, as you'll see in the characters I'm going to go through in this recording, there's some characters who really don't have much history and really not very many appearances, and yet seem to get included in Who's Who, which tends to make me think they were padding it out a bit. And other evidence for that is the fact that DC took 26 issues to put out Who's Who, whereas Marvel managed to do all of their characters in 15. And for that matter, the 15th issue was like on weapons and equipment. And the 13th and 14th were the books of the dead. So characters who were dead, probably most of whom are back by now. But that's another discussion. Okay, so this issue opens. There's an editorial, I guess you'd call it, an introduction in the inside cover, Who Done It, or Who's Who's, Hows and Whys by Marv Wolfman and Len Wein. And they talk a little bit about the history of DC Comics in it. They talk about New Fun Comics, which I believe was the first comic book that DC says in February 1935, New Fun Comics was introduced to the world and DC's history officially began. And there were stories in there by Joe Siegel and Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster. No, not in that issue, but 6 months later, they created Dr. Occult in there. And another comic that came along very soon thereafter was New Comics, which then later became New Adventure, which later became Adventure Comics, and Adventure Comics would run into the 80s. I think it ended in the 80s. It ran for over 500 issues. The Legion of Superheroes, I believe, was featured in Adventure Comics for quite a few years before they got their own book. Actually, it was Superboy and the Legion of Superheroes, I believe, in Adventure. Then they spun them off into their own book. And yeah, I'm not sure exactly how that worked, because I think they took over the same numbering. They continued the numbering for Adventure, or something like that. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe it's from Superboy that they continued the numbering. Detective Comics they mentioned. Of course, Batman didn't appear in the first issue of Detective Comics. He didn't appear till number 27. But Slam Bradley, a character that's still around, although doesn't have a whole ton of appearances, did appear in the first issue of Detective Comics and is another character that was created by Siegel and Schuster. Notice I didn't try to use their first names. And then they mentioned, of course, Action Comics, which introduced Superman, who's considered to be the first superhero, even if he isn't the first character from that era that is still around. And, of course, that led to Batman and Wonder Woman and Green Lantern and Hawkman, blah, 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 and so on and so forth. And at this point, they're still talking about this series only going to run 24 issues, although in the end it ended up running 26 issues. So I think that's about it as far as that editorial goes. Okay, so now we get into some of these obscure characters. And I always thought these characters had a lot of appearances, but I sat down and I took a little bit of time and I looked them up on Comic Book DB, actually to the degree that I could, because the first one, Automan, which makes me think of the 1980s TV show of that name, Automan, which I think only ran for a single season. I didn't do any research on that, but I did used to watch that. And it kind of had like a virtual reality. No, I don't think it had a virtual reality element to it. It certainly had a science fiction element to it, though. And I remember enjoying it. Anyway, I'm off on a tangent. So Automan was kind of a robot, and this is, like I was saying, I thought this character had like a whole run of appearances somewhere. So I looked him up. Well, it turns out he doesn't even have a listing in the comic book database, Comic Book DB. There's no listing for Automan. I tried typing in the name, pulls up nothing. So I looked up his first appearance. Well, on the cover of his first appearance, it says Automan in, and I can't remember the name of the story. So I did a little more searching around on the internet. There are 3 appearances of this character. 3 appearances, and he's getting an entry in Who's Who. I mean, what? What? That just seems silly to me. And so you've got a history of him here. He first appeared in Tales of the Unexpected, number 91. He also appeared in issue 94 and issue 97. And from what I can determine, those are his only appearances. But basically, he's a sentient robot, I believe. And yeah, I mean, he's married, or he has a life mate, Ilda. Some nice drawings by, who was it, Alex Saviuk and Romeo Tangal. But, yeah. And I think you can pick those up for not too much. I mean, unless they're in, like, perfect condition, then you might have to pay $100 or something for them. But I did a little bit of research on some of these. A lot of these comics, these Silver Age comics, are not that expensive because these characters are not in high demand. Now, if the characters, show up in a movie or something, well, hey, the prices of those books are probably going to go through the roof. So that's Automan. And actually, he only gets half a page. He probably doesn't even deserve that, but it's a nice drawing. It's an interesting idea. Maybe they had plans for him that just never came to fruition. I don't know. The next character is Azrael. And Azrael is a character who appeared in the New Teen Titans comic books, both New Teen Titans and Tales of the Teen Titans. A number of times in the 80s, I believe, the late 80s, mid to late 80s. At the time that this issue came out, his first appearance was actually a month before this issue of Who's Who. So I guess they must have had plans for him. But anyway, he's an alien, he's a space traveler, he's got wings, and the picture is by Jose Luis Garcia Lopez and Romeo Tangal. And he didn't have a ton of appearances, once again. And he was brand new, but he still got half a page. The next character who gets a full page is Babe, who is a character from Atari Force. Comic book I haven't really read. I think I read a couple of issues back when they were first coming out in the early, mid-'80s. But I haven't read any since then. I recognize the character by appearance, but I don't know too much about him. According to the entry, he is strong, he's big, and he's got the mind of a child. Other than without reading the entry here, and you can probably get this information online, or you can find this issue, the second issue of Who's Who. There really isn't too much more about him. I mean, he's kind of purple and blue, or he's blue with a purple outfit, or is that his skin? Actually, I'm not sure. I want to think that's an outfit that he's wearing. So next, we have Balloon Buster. Now, Balloon Buster is a war character. He first appeared in All-American Men of War number 112, and I always assumed he had a lot more appearances than apparently he does. He appeared in 4 issues of All-American Men of War, once in Our Fighting Forces, and then 3 issues of Star-Spangled War Stories and 6 issues of Unknown Soldier. And then that was it. That was in 1982, those last 6 issues. And actually it had been 8 years prior to that when he had appeared in Star-Spangled War Stories. And then there was nothing until 1997 when he appeared in a couple annuals, one of which I bought at Baltimore Comic Con this year, the Batman Legends of the Dark Knight annual number 7. I haven't read it yet. But I haven't read any of his appearances, so when I read that, that'll probably be the first appearance of him that I've read. But the picture is drawn by Joe Kubert, and it's a very nice picture. And basically, Balloon Buster was an American fighting on the side of the Allies, of course, during World War I. And he specialized in shooting down German balloons. That's why they called him Balloon Buster. And a number of his appearances he has are duels, I guess, with the enemy ace, Hans von Hammer, who was a German pilot. And in case I didn't make it clear, he's a pilot. Balloon Buster's also a pilot. And so all those appearances in Star-Spangled War Stories, which is 181 to 183, and Unknown Soldier, which is 262 through 267, all of those feature both Balloon Buster and Enemy Ace. I'm not sure if they're billed as Balloon Buster stories or Enemy Ace stories, but so yeah, he doesn't have any superpowers. He's basically just an ace, a really hotshot pilot, and I'm kind of curious. I'd like to read some of these stories. Some of them are drawn by John Severin. There's at least a couple drawn, I think, by Russ Heath. And so I'm curious to read some of them. And when I looked them up, they didn't seem too outrageously expensive either. Although the stuff that I found online for sale wasn't in great shape. We were talking like very good, maybe fine condition at best. But, maybe $10 an issue or something like that. So maybe I'll try and look some of those up or buy some of those. Okay, so the last character is Baron Bedlam. Baron Bedlam was like the initial villain in the first 2 issues. The initial villain to show up in Batman and the Outsiders, which was a comic book that I really loved. Well, okay, I really loved it for the first 8 issues because that's all that I bought back then. And then I don't know why I stopped buying it, but that's the way I collected back then. I have never been a diehard collector, even though I have been reading fairly consistently now for about a dozen years. I've been reading very consistently for about a dozen years. I have never been somebody who stuck with a book and bought the book year in and year out. Even the things that I really liked, like All-Star Squadron, which I eventually collected all of and read all of, which was 67 issues plus 3 annuals. I didn't, there was times when I stopped buying it and then I'd have to go back and pick up the back issues. Because there were times when I just stopped reading comics. I stopped buying comics. And then a year would go and then I would start again. And I have just never been the sort of guy who goes to the comic shop every week or every month. And, and nowadays I don't even go to the comic shop. I buy most of my stuff online. But anyway, getting back to Baron Bedlam. This is drawn by Jim Aparo, the pictures, and he was a villain. He was an enemy of Batman, the Outsiders, and really more specifically of Geoforce, because he came from Markovia, which is the country that Geoforce was from. And he didn't have any superpowers. Well, he temporarily had superpowers, but he was... he basically was shrewd and evil. And, and his name, Bedlam, the name that he took, is an anagram of his actual last name, which is Delam. So I thought that was kind of funny. I didn't know that. Or if I did, I'd forgotten. And so that's it for Who's Who. And I'll also be going through... So that's it for Who's Who, for my first swipe at, or the first few pages of Who's Who number 2 from April 1985. The official handbook of the Marvel Universe, issue 2. I'm just going to cover the first few pages here in this entry. I guess the first thing to note is that unlike the DC, there's no editorial in this at all. I think there was an editorial in the back of the first issue, but there's no editorial in this at all. It's all entries. It also doesn't look like they pad them like I implied, or no, I really said that DC padded them by including characters who had like 2 and 3 appearances, although you'll see that a couple of these characters haven't appeared very frequently. But for the most part, these characters are characters that I am at least familiar with, even if I haven't read a ton of their appearances. So the first character is Baron Mordo, and this is a Doctor Strange villain. The most interesting thing about this entry is that there's a lot of detail here about magic in general and his powers. And I guess this is probably the first character in the OHotMU of magical ability, or I don't know, maybe not, but there's quite a bit in here about different kinds of magic, and I'm not going to read it, and the way that Baron Mordo operates and the kind of things he can do, he's capable of. And actually there's considerably more here about his powers than there is about his origin. And he first appeared in the Silver Age. He appeared fairly frequently over the years. And the other thing that I noted, and I really have to wonder about some of these, in the DC Who's Who, they made a point in that editorial at the beginning of saying they're not going to get into, well, I can't remember exactly how they put it, but they basically said they're not going to get into details about how strong somebody is and who can beat who. But Marvel seems to go the other way, and I don't know if DC was doing that in reaction to Marvel, because I believe the official handbook, the OHotMU, came out before the Who's Who. So it may be something of a reaction, you know. So you get things like how far can somebody fly, how fast can they fly, how much weight can they lift, and other various measurements of their abilities. So, and there's a little bit of that in here, although not so much with the magic. Yeah, I don't think there's very much of that with the magic. But let's see. Oh yeah, the other thing I wanted to point out was that he's 6 feet tall and he weighs 250 pounds, which makes him sound kind of overweight. Especially, I figure this guy is a magician or a wizard or a sorcerer. That's what his occupation is listed as, a sorcerer. And I don't think he's the sort of character to be hitting the gym very much. So that 250 pounds seems like a lot of weight to be carrying for somebody that's only 6 feet tall. So, and this picture is drawn by Paul Smith. Very nice. So that's it for Baron Mordo. Next character, there isn't quite as much about him, is Baron Zemo. And Baron Zemo, I'm also familiar with. I've read a couple of appearances. I'm probably more familiar with them than I am by his stuff I've read about him, stuff I've heard about him, then I've actually read stories about him. He's the son of the original Baron Zemo to appear in comic books, although, as I understand it, he is the 13th Baron Zemo. He's a German scientist, and when he first appeared, he was using the name Phoenix, and that was in Captain America number 168, and then he subsequently appeared in Captain America, and I think that was basically the only appearance that he had as Phoenix, really. And then he appeared as Baron Zemo in Captain America number 276, which I think was the last issue that I got in my when I had a subscription to Captain America back in the early 1980s. Let's see, anything else about him? Well, I mean, in comparison to Baron Mordo, Baron Zemo is 5'10", 2 inches shorter, and he weighs 180 pounds, 70 pounds less. So, and then the other thing is his costume, which I always thought looked kind of silly, you know. It's another one of these Nazi-type characters who wears pink and purple and yellow. And I don't know if they're trying to tone them down, make them less scary. I don't know. I'm not sure. But, and you know, the fur trim, the fur lining on the boots, and I don't know, it all just seems kind of silly to me. But okay, so the next page has 2 characters on it, one of which the type is really small, and it looks like it was originally going to be a full-page entry, which is a little strange because this is a character who has not appeared very often, and this character is called Basilisk. And he first appeared in Marvel Team-Up number 16. He appeared basically in 2 stories prior to this, to the OHotMU. And one was in 74 and the other was in 76. And then this issue of OHotMU is from 83. So, 7 years later. And Basilisk is his powers come from a Kree, or an object, a power object created by the alien Kree. And he can shoot I-beams that can either cause things to drop in temperature severely or increase in temperature severely. And he's got some super strength, and he is very tough skin. He can go through lava. And I'm not really very familiar with this character. I haven't read any of his appearances. Basically, his early appearances were in Marvel Team-Up and also in an issue of Marvel 2-in-1. I'm kind of interested in reading one of those because I don't know, I like the cover art from the Marvel Team-Up. There's a crossover between Marvel Team-Up and Marvel 2-in-1, and I'm not too sure. I think both of those issues are actually in the essential volumes for Marvel Team-Up and Marvel 2-in-1, if you have those. I think the second volume of each, well, I'm not sure. But and he certainly looks more fearsome than Baron Zemo does. His costume is green and yellow, but he's got these weird bugged out eyes, and and he also has appeared in a number of stories in between 2009 and 2011. He appeared in a number of stories. I'm not too sure if he was the main villain because from what I saw, it looked like there was a bunch, so it looked like he was part of a league of supervillains, or I don't know what the name of the group was, but maybe it was the Serpent Society, though a basilisk isn't exactly a serpent, although it is a reptile, so I don't know. Let's see, and I think that's about it for him. He was originally a burglar, and it's kind of funny because he says he's a former burglar, but he's now a professional criminal. So I guess a burglar is not a professional criminal. But the next entry is Batroc, also known as Batroc the Leaper, or the Leaper. And he's a French mercenary. He's super fit. He's very knowledgeable in martial arts. And the only comic that I think I've read that he appeared in was in the Captain America War and Remembrance collection, which was by Roger Stern and John Byrne. And I think he was teamed up with Mr. Hyde. But it was an okay issue, nothing too great, but certainly not the highlight of that collection. But he goes back to the Silver Age. He first appeared in Tales of Suspense number 75. And I think that's about it for Batroc. Okay, the next character is a big one, and that's Beast, Hank McCoy, of the X-Men, later of the Avengers, also later of the Defenders. I've read quite a few stories that feature the Beast, including the original run of X-Men. I have the X-Men Omnibus, and I've read that. I've read some of the stories that he appeared in the Avengers after he became further mutated and became the Blue Beast, although he originally was the Gray Beast for a few issues, and then he became blue. And so he first appeared in X-Men number 1, but he first became the Furry Beast in Amazing Adventures number 11, but I think he was the Gray Beast at that point, and I think it was only for a few issues that he was gray, and then he became the Blue Beast. And that happened when he was working for the Brand Corporation, whose name I've heard. He was a genetic researcher for them at the time, and he was doing some experiments, and so he experimented on himself with a serum that he developed, and he ended up being permanently changed into this blue furry version of himself. He's super strong, he's super agile, both of which I think he had before he became the blue furry beast. And they also make some mention that he has a healing factor, which that was something which didn't show up until after he became the blue furry beast. And although they make it sound like it was very strong at first, but then it kind of toned down, and this would have been about the same time that Wolverine appeared on the scene, or Wolverine started to appear in X-Men, I think. So I don't know what the dynamic is between the two, if they thought they could have another character. And honestly, I don't know. That's a good question. What is the origin of, or the development of Wolverine's healing factor? Because, I mean, it got to the point where, and I'm getting a little off topic here, but it got to the point where he, it seemed like he could heal almost anything, And, I mean, at what point did it first appear? Because it probably didn't appear immediately. So I'm kind of curious about that now that I think about that. Maybe one of these days I'll look into that. But let's see. So I think that's everything for the Beast. There's just 2 more characters, and they share a page. So these are rather short entries. And the first one is the Beetle. Now, he originally appeared in Strange Tales number 123, but then he got a better suit in Spectacular Spider-Man number 58. And he is a professional criminal, so he was never a burglar. But he was current member of the Masters of Evil, former employee of Justin Hammer, who I believe is a character that appeared in Iron Man originally. And the Beetle originally appeared, I believe, in a story against the Fantastic Four or the Human Torch. But then he went on, and he's appeared in a number of different books: Spider-Man, Iron Man, Daredevil, The Avengers. There's probably some other books. And he's had a number of appearances over the years. He's not a character, and all of his powers come from the suit that he wears, which allows him to fly, gives him super strength. I think he can do some other things with it. And yeah, so that's the Beetle. And I really haven't read any. I don't know. Maybe I've read some stories that the Beetle's appeared in, but he just seems like a generic villain who has a battle suit that allows him to do special stuff. I can't think of anything distinctive about him. And the final character that I'm going to talk about is Belladonna. Now, this is another character who did not have very many appearances. In fact, I think she's only really had 3 appearances if you don't count appearances in books like this, the OHotMU, at least according to Comic Book DB. her real name is Narda Ravana. Not sure what origin that would be. But she's from Boston. She had a fashion and cosmetics business with her sister, Desiree. And let's see, she first appeared in Spectacular Spider-Man number 43. Now, the character here, the drawing here, was done by Marie Severin. And while her first appearance wasn't drawn by Marie Severin, her other two appearances, which were in Spectacular Spider-Man 47 and 48, were drawn by Marie Severin. She doesn't have any superpowers, but she does have weapons, which a gas gun which fires various types of gas, and I guess this has to do with her cosmetics business. They've developed chemicals that do certain things that put people to sleep, and also they mentioned that one of the effects that her gas gun can do is it actually dissolves Spider-Man's web fluid. At least when he first encounters her, it does, and then he does something. He reworks the formula of his web fluid, and that so it's no longer affected by her gas gun. But okay, so that's it for I think 7 entries, and that's it for the opening part of the second issue of the official Handbook of the Marvel Universe. Before this book is done, we'll be into probably halfway through the Seas. This book goes from Baron Mordo to the Collective Man. It also has a section on alien races, and some of these I am actually familiar with. In fact, a number of these I'm familiar with, unlike the last book. And there's also a much longer appendix section, so who knows how much of that I'll go through. But, wow, that's interesting. Yes. So that's it for the first section of the second issue of the OHotMU. Thank you to Comic Book DB, which can be found at comicbookdb.com, and the Grand Comics Database, which can be found at comics.org. Both of them helped me when preparing for this episode and are great resources if you have questions about comic books and continuity and that kind of stuff. That's it for episode 56 of Dave Talks Comics. Next time on Dave Talks Comics, I will be talking about the first 5 episodes of Season 2 of Justice League Unlimited. I'm Dave. Thank you for listening.